Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to Reverb. My name is Alex Helberg, and I'm joined on the mic, as always, by my co-producer and co-host, Calvin Pollock. How's it going, Calvin?
Doing great, Alex. How about you?
I am just super. We are, of course, very excited to join all of our listeners once again today for another installment in our Rejoinder series. I guess, did we talk about this? Is it going to be a rejoinder?
I think it should be. I
I
think I
think
have
it
a
should
lot
be.
to rejoin. Yeah, and I'm happy to rejoin you for this conversation. Yeah. This is a really important artifact, I think, to rejoin, to critique, to provide more context around the claims of. And so I'm really excited to get into it.
Me too. Yeah, I think we both texted each other probably nearly simultaneously when we found out that this artifact was going to be dropping to our streaming services and said we have to do an episode on this. We are of course talking about Oprah Winfrey's new special from ABC called AI and the Future of Us. And so, Calvin, I just want to ask you, I guess, what was your reaction when you first saw that none other than the great media giant, erstwhile presidential candidate, maybe at some point in the future, Oprah Winfrey, was
Yeah.
dropping a special on AI? What was your reaction?
I mean, I was just like, this is gonna be this is gonna be amazing. I think I actually expected it to be funnier and stupider than it actually ended up being. No offense to Oprah, but like she's a mainstream figure. I expected this to be all kind of wonder appeals about AI and just like how amazing it is, and you get AI and you get AI. Like that's kind of what I thought the tone of it was going to be, but it was actually, there was some nuance here that I'm excited to talk about. But of course
There,
there was
yeah,
also a lot of propaganda.
of
Um
course.
but yeah, no, I think, and the other thing I would say is that when I saw that this was coming out, it felt interestingly timed given the rather outsized role Oprah has been playing in this election season, being a featured speaker at the DNC, and then
Yes.
also in the week or so since the this AI special came out, she did a major interview, one-on-one interview with Kamala Harris. And so it felt like Oprah also wanting to make important political points about AI during an election season, which we'll talk about later.
Absolutely. Yeah, I echo a lot of the things that you said there, Calvin, especially with I assumed that everyone who was in the audience for this special was going to get a, like, now everybody look under your seats. You get a subscription to GPT-4. You get a subscription to GPT-4.
You get a custom tuned GPT.
Yes, you get an AI friend. It's all, yeah, no, there was not any of that. It was not the kind of joyous romp that a lot of her television program was. I also, of course, am skeptical of, taking into context who Oprah is, not only in her role contemporarily, but, she was also the person who brought mainstream attention and a platform to the likes of Dr. Phil and Dr. Oz, the latter of whom, turned out to be an incredibly reactionary political figure. And yeah, is kind of giving voice to a lot of kind of dubious narratives in the past. And again, that's not to say that that utterly blemishes somebody's reputation, but it is just to say that, going on Oprah is not the same as being published in a scientific journal. You know what I mean? Like she's not an arbiter of absolute scientific truth by any means. And I think that that's especially important when we're talking about something that has as much technical nuance as artificial intelligence and particularly language models, which seems to be the kind of focus of this special, which I also thought was kind of interesting. They didn't really talk about a lot of the other kinds of applications of transformer models or the kind of nits and the nitty gritty of AI beyond just chat GPT or image generators.
Right, that's true. There was a little bit of discussion of AI video, AI images, but yeah, you're right. It was largely focused on LLMs. And I mean, I think that makes sense to some extent because that's the part of artificial intelligence, quote unquote, that consumers and audience members are likely to be the most familiar with. But you're right that it limited the discussion to some extent. And it made the discussion actually, even though it was intended to explain this broader AI phenomenon, it made a lot of it quite confusing because we're talking about this thing that apparently is moving so fast and it's here and soon it's going to be so powerful that it understands itself better than we understand it. And there were all these massive wonder claims like that were hard to wrap my head around as a listener because the examples were kind of lacking.
Yeah, that's an absolutely important point to contextualize, right? Is that, you and I have studied this to a greater or lesser degree. We are both people that work in education surrounding the practice of writing, have practiced, using AI tools as part of our pedagogy and other things of that nature, have done things like corpus linguistics in the past. So have a little bit more technical knowledge on this. What we want to do here is go through some of the different segments of this Oprah AI special and especially land on some of those points where we feel that this kind of mystification and the wonder claims are really being accentuated and provide a little bit of a corrective perspective to the hyperbolic, kind of glorification of AI that's being set out in these segments. So I like the fact, Calvin, that you mentioned that, the sort of intended audience for doing a little rhetorical analysis of this piece, intended audience of this ABC special, this is network television. It's probably presumed to be a, what you might pejoratively call a lay audience. And I'm putting that in heavy quotation marks because that's literally how the opening speaker introduces herself. So I want us to just take a listen to some of the first voices that we hear from this special. The people who are talking, who are unnamed, are not given title cards, but who are just introduced as people who are wondering about AI and the role that it will play in our lives. Let's take a listen.
As a total layperson, I don't really know what artificial intelligence even really is made up of, other than ChatGPT and what I see on social media.
The first thing that kind of comes to mind is just like the Terminator movies.
In a way, we've always been interacting with some sort of artificial intelligence. It's just much more in our face right now.
What scares me about AI is that the technology seems to be advancing so quickly.
One day we weren't talking about it, and then the next day it wasn't just that we were talking about it, it was there for us to use without really even understanding it.
AI is happening. It's going to happen.
The question I would have for anyone who has power over the development is, how are we going to make this work for us?
I don't know what the agenda is with the people who's even creating AI. To me, it's like, what is really the point? Why do we need AI?
Yep.
So why do we need AI? I like that they landed on that question as the last.
Yeah. I like that too. I mean, it seems like at that point you can just turn off the program. Why do we need it? Okay,
Yeah.
Screw it. I'm not gonna.
Yeah. If you're having
engage with it,
yeah, if you have to ask that question, I mean,
maybe you don't need it.
maybe you don't. That was literally what I was thinking when I first heard that. Was like, well, if you literally, if you have somebody in the audience who's an ostensible, kind of stand-in for the layperson, quote unquote, audience who's asking, why do we need AI? That already tells you something, I think, about the way that public discourse is, how it's going, you might say.
Yeah.
Which is that a lot of people just seem to be very confused about the, arrival of this technology in our lives.
Yeah, and I mean, I think something important to talk about right at the beginning, and it comes up in these talking head quotes, is that we're applying this single term, artificial intelligence, to a bunch of different but related technologies that it's questionable whether you should actually apply that term to it. And it's something that
Yes.
I think at this point, I'm at the point where I have effectively rooted out the use of the term AI when I talk about this stuff with students and with colleagues, because I like to be as specific as possible. I'm talking about large language models. That's its own technology. And I don't think it's artificial intelligence.
Right.
The reason to me it's not artificial intelligence is because it has no understanding of situation or intention or audience or social values, any of these things that we kind of take as basic human intelligence. It can't understand those things because it's really just drawing from a frozen training data set and making predictions based on that training data set. So it's really not, it's accessing a big file of information, but it's not situationally understanding what's going on an ongoing real-time basis in the way that human intelligence does. And so to me, like, I guess if you really put a heavy emphasis on the artificial part, you can call it intelligence. Yes, it's a very artificial version of intelligence, but I don't like using that term because to me it's so it falls so short of human intelligence. And that's why I like to call it large language models. But it's so interesting how people kind of say AI is happening, it's going to happen. And it's
like it's a process.
Yeah, like what do you mean by that? Specific companies and specific technologists are developing a specific set of technologies, but that doesn't make it like a natural phenomenon that's happening in the world. So it's fascinating the disparate things that are getting referred to with this term AI, and the way in which AI is being rendered as a single object that exists naturally now in our world and that we all have to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you were talking there, I was thinking about, if we were to put this in the stasis framework of, sort of like, where are we at in this argument space from,
we've skipped past existence.
We've skipped past existence. We've skipped past definition critically, as you've pointed out. Like, is this even like, what do we mean when we say artificial intelligence? And we moved directly to action. Which I think, research tells us is always typically a sign that if you're being asked to skip to the action stasis without deliberating some of the other stasis categories, sort of like what caused this? How did it get here? And why are we defining it in a certain way? Is it, to what degree can we say that parts of it are malignant or beneficent? Then there are a lot of hidden assumptions that are being bracketed or being sort of buried underground when if you're curious why it can be so unproductive and harmful to skip past stasis, you can go back to our episode with Robin Reams from a couple months ago, where Dr. Reams gave an amazing explanation of why it can be so useful for critical thinking and, like, honestly policy wisdom and moral wisdom to go through the stases in the proper order. Yes, absolutely. But Oprah, of course, is also kind of giving us this line that no, AI is here and it's something that we have to reckon with. But don't take my word for it. Take Oprah's word for it. Here she is.
But there's no doubt it is here. Artificial intelligence is here, and life for all of us is about to be very different.
So that is one of the first lines that Oprah herself speaks in the special. How did you react to that, Calvin?
This seems to really be the purpose of the first chunk here, which is the agenda with Sam Altman, where it's kind of this assumption that our lives are going to change dramatically in the next 10 years as a result of this. And it's not explained how or why that is going to happen. But it's just sort of this thing that we all need to buy into. And I think this comes back to conversations that we were having about 2 years ago when all of this started, where it felt a lot like the crypto bubble and like the NFT bubble, where tech is really investing heavily in this technology and marketing it in a certain way. And part of how you keep the investment skyrocketing is by maintaining these tropes in the media that, like, it's going to change everything.
Right. It's all about confidence. I mean, literally, the root of the term con man is confidence man. And it's all about making the mark, the audience that you're trying to reach, feel that sense of confidence that you have in this scam that you're running. And I mean, again, not to say that all of AI is a scam necessarily, but we're being given this sense that, like, again, when you're being given that sort of epistemic statement, there is no doubt it is here. Artificial intelligence is here. I mean, it's like when you have that repeated to you in those emphatic terms, it's almost like you can't, if you know what to listen for there, you can't hear that as anything other than you have to believe that this is here. Like, we are so desperate for you to believe that AI is here, because, and it's also interesting too, because if we all already took it for granted that it was here, you wouldn't need to say that.
Right. So it's clearly an appeal that people apparently need to be given. And it feels very messianic in that way. It feels almost pseudo-religious, this idea that it's here, bow down before it. And that gets into some of this like AI hype rhetoric, where this is something that is kind of otherworldly and transformative, and like it's a kind of deus ex machina that will like permanently change the story of whether it's our kind of day-to-day lives, or it's like our country's politics, our country's international relations. That all comes up in this special.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to me too that, you know, when we talk about the way that it's going to shape the world, that they do at least offer, and I think we heard this in one of the first questions that somebody asked, you know, I don't know what the agenda is with the people who are even creating AI. So they call the very first chapter of this special the agenda. And the interviewee for this is none other than OpenAI CEO Sam Altman. So we are going to listen here to just a couple of clips. The first one that I want to play for you is, again, really kind of emphasizing, you know, kind of the assumptions that Calvin was talking about here, that we're not arguing about whether or not AI is here, whether or not it is moving fast. The first question that Oprah asks is, how fast is AI moving? Let's take a listen.
How fast is this moving? Well, 4 years ago, most of the world, if they thought about AI, thought about self-driving cars or some other thing or whatever.
I just wanted to stop on that line specifically, because that does seem to be a kind of like flippant kind of diss to Elon Musk, to me at least, for the, you know, when we're thinking about, you know, self-driving cars or whatever, like you couldn't see Sam Altman's face there, but he made a little bit of a gesture with his he made a little bit of a facial expression that kind of said that, oh yeah, this crazy dream of self-driving cars that nobody buys anymore.
Which, you know, it wasn't just Elon Musk. That was a massive, I think what's interesting there is the kind of the implicit appeal to the idea that this is not a similar bubble. That like that was like a crazy idea that we had several years ago that was very quickly revealed to be bankrupt. But a lot of people were invested in that. Like pretty much all of the major tech companies had investment in that. And then it quickly flamed out. But I don't think it's disappeared. I think it'll come back.
Oh, definitely not. Yeah. But I mean, it is also interesting that that's being used as this kind of offhand reference of like, well, it's not like this other thing that we, you know, that we now regard as, you know, as kind of dubious. It's totally something different. So he continues here.
Do you think it's moving too fast?
My current belief is no, but I could imagine things that would change that quickly. And I would say, okay, this is moving too fast.
Like what? What would change that?
If we made an AI system that was better at doing AI research than all of OpenAI, and you could push a button and just say, improve really fast. That's an example of something I think would be moving too fast.
So what do you think of Sam Altman's definition of an AI system that's moving too fast is one that can outpace the research that his company is currently doing?
Yeah, like that's a very handy definition of that for you. Like, you don't want the AI to take your jobs. You just want it to take everyone else's jobs. So that was funny. But it's just like, this is a bad example of technical communication to me, and kind of like public accommodation of science, where this is a really hard example to wrap your head around. Like, I don't know what that would mean. And yeah, and again, like, I think this gets back to the ways in which what we're talking about with AI is very inscrutable to me, because how would the AI system continue doing that research without being prompted? I don't think they have built AI systems yet that can do that. Number one, that level of autonomy, I think, has not been achieved yet.
It has indeed not been achieved. I can say that with relative confidence here, that at the very least, there is nothing resembling autonomous agents in current AI research. The entirety of the transformer model that currently runs most AI systems is that it requires human input in order to generate output. And, you know, if you get something that is its own closed system, it just ends up turning into a feedback loop that really doesn't make much sense. So,
and so I think, like, with this example, you would have to continue prompting it, right, for it to be doing that, and then it would get better. Like, say you had this amazing model, you could prompt it to improve its own research, improve its own model. You would then keep prompting it, right?
Yeah, you would still have to
understand this philosophically. Like, you would still have to give it more direction, and then it could just keep getting better. So, boom, good for you. Your job is secure.
Yeah, it really doesn't make much sense. I found it to be kind of this weirdly, you know, kind of tellingly self-serving line that Sam Altman just kind of drops. It doesn't even have to make sense. It's just, to me, it felt like a little bit of an exposure of his own insecurities about, you know, the kind of like AI casualization for thee, not for me, from Sam Altman. So let's listen to, you know, when he does talk about some of the good things that would come out of this. Specifically, Oprah gives him, I think, a pretty interesting question about bias in data sets, or the fact that, you know, even like the staffing of teams for OpenAI is not very diverse, and how are we going to be sure that it's going to represent the interests of people other than white men, of whom AI researchers are overly represented. So here's what he has to say to that.
The most important thing that will happen here is everyone in the world will be able to create at a level that is still hard for us to imagine. This is gonna be an enabler of human ability to create, to flourish, to make new things, to create new companies and services like we've never seen. And we want everybody to get to do that, not just the white dudes.
So a rising tide lifts all boats. What do you think, Calvin?
Yeah, this felt to me like we should maybe give this to grad students to say, this is how not to answer a question at a job interview or in a job talk, because this is like a really bad answer to a question about diversity, equity, and inclusion. You're saying, we're just going to give everyone tools, the same set of tools, and pray that that helps everyone equally. Like, it seems like an extremely naive way to understand inequality. And it's also just, it comes back to this strange rhetoric that's not clarifying what the technology does. He calls it an enabler of human ability to create, to flourish, to make new things, to create new companies and services like we've never seen. All of that requires material capital.
Yes.
And requires a huge social infrastructure that not everyone has equal access to. Like, create companies. You really think everyone, not just white dudes, are going to be able to do that just simply because they have an LLM? Like, that's not feasible. There's another example. He was asked by Oprah in another part of this conversation, like, in your wildest dreams, like, what might AI enable you to do? And his example basically was, come up with a design for a house and build a house. And the thing that I was thinking is, like, well, what if I can't afford a down payment? Right. There's all this material and social and economic infrastructure that's necessary to do any of these things. And that also feels like such a prosaic example of, just like imagining the new worlds we can build. You're just going to build a different, slightly different type of McMansion. And that's super exciting.
Yeah, it's that house. It's also critical to note that while he's, you know, kind of waxing poetic about this beautiful house, they actually have a graphic on the screen that shows us the house. You know, a computer or CGI rendering of it.
I assume I was assuming, and I'd be curious to look into this, that all of the, or much of the sort of hypothetical video that were shown throughout the special was generated using AI video models. But
that's
I
a possibility. I haven't looked into that, but that would be interesting to note, especially just given how, again, thinking about how resource intensive that process is, how much electricity it uses, how many server farms are needed and data centers are needed to power that kind of thing. And speaking of which, if we're talking about material things and how Mr. Altman is, kind of addressing this idea of how we are going to get to this point, Oprah asks him a really, really interesting question about his relationship with the government that I think is very important to land on. So let's go ahead and listen to what he has to say about OpenAI's relationship with the US government.
I personally probably have some conversation with someone in the government every few days.
Every few
Same.
days.
And
Yeah, who doesn't?
What the US needs to do to lead here, how we're going to build enough data centers, how we're going to deal with chips and where those chips are produced, and make sure that geopolitically we have a good strategy there.
I like to talk with the government every couple of days about how the entirety of the U.S. state and foreign policy apparatus can be usefully marshaled for my own personal gain. Like,
Yeah.
what? That is such an insane thing to admit publicly. What?
Yeah. I personally have a conversation with the government, probably have some conversation with someone in the government every few days. They're just
Who's
reading
that?
they're reading my texts.
I was just
They're,
about to-
looking at pictures of my cats. And that's important for us to come up with a strategy for raising my cats well, ensuring that they maintain their health, and that, sorry, I'm trying to imitate Sam Altman's speaking style. But yeah, no, this was an amazing little tell about the amount of power this guy has. And it made me think a little bit about our episode a few years ago where we were analyzing national security strategy documents from the Trump administration about China and about chips and how significant that is in US policy. I mean, this is one of the kind of top paramount issues is supply chains and chip production. And yeah, just this is another example of not providing clarity to the public. You're being asked about something really important with a ton of significance and a ton of stakes. And you just sort of toss off, yeah, we're talking about chips, talking about the best ways for me to get the best chips, and that'll be great for me.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and again, I think it's it's inherent to a lot of libertarian fantasies, especially rich libertarians, that something that is good for me is necessarily good for the entire American public because, I am a stand-in for the American public. I am a stand-in for, the economic health and strength of America. And it seems like Sam Altman is a little high on his own supply here to the degree that he doesn't even recognize that to a different kind of listener like you or I, this just sounds like he's using his government context to enrich himself, which I think sounds pretty much like exactly what he's doing.
Yeah. And this, we're going to come back to this later, but this feels extremely striking given the extent to which China is demonized in this special too.
Oh, yes, 100%. But before we get there, there's another section that comes up here. We're just going to listen really briefly to one part of this. The second section, Calvin, do you want to read off what this one is called?
Yeah, absolutely. Holy shit. So this is kind of the wonder section where we're saying, holy shit, AI is really able to do some things that will blow your mind.
Yes. But once again, rather than telling us and educating viewers on how the technology works and giving us an actual, educational viewpoint on how to think about these things, we are given the examples, the output primarily. So presenting here is Marques Brownlee, a YouTuber, and again, they're quoting him as a kind of tech expert. I think mainly what he does is review tech products on YouTube. Yeah. So to that degree, he is an expert. But here he is showing Oprah an AI generated video, and you'll hear the way that he's describing it here, but there's some things that I think also jumped out to me as being a little problematic. Let's listen.
Here's another one. This one's a little more interesting. It's a handheld cinematic shot of a child on a beach holding an ice cream cone.
That's what you asked for. That's what you typed in.
That's what I typed in.
I'm assuming that AI had this stored somewhere, the picture of the child.
AI has millions of photos and videos of millions of children stored.
What?
That it's trained on.
Okay.
That's not good, man.
Is this a real child?
It's not a real child, but it looks like one because it's trained on a ton of real children.
Is that real ice cream?
It sure looks like it.
I love that. Like she almost asked that part more gravely than is that a real child? Is that real ice cream? How dare they?
It's just this nice cutesy way to play off this horrifying fact that, like, oh, by the way, AI has millions of photos of your children in its data sets.
Absolutely. No, and this is like, I mean, this gets at all of the things that Emily Bender and other critical AI scholars have been trying to warn us about for years, which is issues like training data extraction.
Yes.
If your child's photo is in the training data, hackers can brute force the algorithm and potentially get your child's photo out. But yeah, this is sort of tossed off as if it's just like, wow, cool, this is an amazing technology. Holy shit, it can do these amazing things. And the ethics of it are not explored at all. And it seems like Marcus Brownlee is not concerned about them either. And it's just sort of framed as this is a new technology that we should play around with and review, but otherwise not think too hard about.
Yeah. As a viewer, I think we are, again, compelled to think less about the millions of children line. Again, I'm like, just the way that he says it, it's trained on millions of children. I'm imagining like
That's
children
horrifying.
on hamster wheels in like an underground bunker that are powering the data centers that power AI. But again, not to play it off as a comic thing, because it really is horrifying the amount of personal data that is being used largely without users' consent to train these models. It's, currently this is something that is currently in litigation from a number of different entities, publishing companies, publications against AI companies for copywriting or for stealing copyrighted data without telling anyone, just because this information is available out on the open web and there are tools to easily, API frameworks that you can use to easily download this data at massive scale.
Do you know if there's any litigation around people's likenesses, either like their photos that they either accidentally or like unwittingly published online or others publish online, or videos or audio, because audio is a big issue too. That's something that Marcus Brownlee demonstrates, is the kind of voice print technology.
Absolutely. So the only one that I can recall right off the top of my head is the Dudesy AI comedy podcast host, which was, again, supposedly it's this project that's run by a couple of different comedians. Will Sasso is one of them, which was really a shame for me. I liked Will Sasso, but to be involved with something like Dudesy AI was a little bit like, hey man, what's going on? He and his co-host trained an AI or basically what ended up happening was they wrote a comedy special in the style of George Carlin, and they published a YouTube video that was called the first ever posthumous AI comedy special, George Carlin, I'm Glad I'm Dead. And I listened to a little bit of it. It's horrifying, just as you would imagine it to be. And I believe his estate successfully got a settlement and from Dudesy and from this comedy podcast, and got them to take down the content because they pretty much knew straight out of the gate that they were going to lose that one.
Right. And so the examples that we have mainly are famous people. I think Beyonce might have raised a complaint about something that used her voice print as well. But I mean, again, like, think about all these people who just like, they wanted to share photos of their kids with their friends on Facebook or on Instagram. And now their kids' likenesses are being used to train these models, and they're in the training data set. That's so twisted and deeply exploitative. And there really seems to be no recourse at this point to get your stuff out of the training data.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So again, brushing over all those ethical issues, we get that sort of, wonder circus of AI audio and video and images from Marquez Brownlee, we get probably one of the funniest transitions between two different speakers, two different sets of speakers on this episode where, she just sort of like Oprah waves goodbye to Marquez Brownlee and says, all right. And next up, and it just from off stage, almost simultaneously in lockstep, step in Asa Raskin and Tristan Harris, the co-founders of the Center for Humane Technology. I mean, what was your reaction to that transition?
Yeah, I love that.
Calvin?
It was like, okay, now you've heard one side, let's hear the other. And these two really are kind of like the token tech critics on the stage, and they're given a very compressed piece of real estate in this episode.
Yes, it's very clear that they are just sort of shoehorning these guys in. So we're going to listen here first to Asa Raskin, who was also the inventor of the infinite scroll technology, or the code for infinite scroll that has been written into most social media platforms at this point. Here is what he says of, his reflections on his invention, despite his best intentions to make it optimize user experiences. Here's what he says it has done instead.
And it's now used to waste over 500,000 human lifetimes every single month. Addiction, doom scrolling, polarization, these are all consequences. And what I learned the hard way is that my good intentions as an inventor just wasn't enough.
So we have this example of, somebody whose invention escaped his good intentions and were used for pernicious purposes, which personally, I just don't know how much I buy that. Like, if you're working for a tech company, presumably, that what you're creating is not necessarily just about optimizing a user experience, but about keeping people's eyes on your app at all times for as long as possible. I mean, that is what primarily drives traffic, engagement, and profit fundamentally, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's possible that he had some awareness at the time, but still went along with it and now wants to speak out about it. Like, I can't really fault him for that. That's a pretty relatable experience. But yes, I agree that, like, if you're working for one of these companies, you should have clear eyes about how they're going to use your work products.
Absolutely. So we get a little bit more here from Tristan Harris and Asa Raskin, repeating this line that AI is just moving so fast. And Oprah opines, why? Why is it moving so fast? Here's what they say.
And AI is moving way faster and is way more powerful in its impact on society than social media.
So explain to me why AI is now moving so fast.
In 2017, there was a huge breakthrough at Google, and researchers there discovered a way that AI could start to learn a kind of universal language where it could speak the language of anything. And then suddenly the same lines of code could learn the language of DNA and learn how to make drugs, could learn the language of images, and could learn to do all those things that Marquez was showing. And so the rate of innovation went through the roof. And of course, once AI can do anything, people start to use it to do everything.
So I actually had to get up and step away from my computer for a couple of seconds after hearing this line, because this is just a load of utter mystification, I think, to say that what AI is doing is learning a kind of universal language of anything is just completely bogus. Right?
Because it implies that language is just form. Right. This comes back to that really important distinction between what LLMs do and what we do when we communicate. LLMs just make connections between form. Humans listen and assess context and like bring to bear tons of tacit and social and implicit knowledge that you've built up from your embodied real-time experience in the world. And the models can't do that. They're basically making mathematical correlations, which isn't to say that language doesn't contain some mathematical correlations. You, of course, are always like making probability assessments in real time and saying like, okay, I think if I say this, I have like a 75% chance of being right. I'm going to try it and see how it goes. that's kind of similar to what LLMs and what these models are doing, but there's so much more that you're bringing to that.
Oh yeah,
that these
exactly.
models cannot.
I mean, yeah, if you think about it, actually people like to talk about the scale of large language model data sets and all the different parameter, billions of parameters or hyperparameters that these things use in terms of, how they weight certain word probabilities and what they're going to give you back. But like, I mean, if you really wanted to stop and think about it for a minute, how that is a relatively discrete and small and closed in set of parameters and variables when you actually think about the decision-making intuition of a human body, which is, again, not just what's going up inside your head, which is more or less for most, for most neuroscientists, still very much a black box, but also what is going on in your body, right? Like, where are you? How are you feeling? What has happened to you earlier that day? What are the kinds of things that are, running through your head at the same time that you're in the middle of this communication scenario? Like, it is not just a sort of raw probability score that you arrive at that makes you concatenate words one after the other. It is largely intuitive. And, we make mistakes, we screw up, but I mean, largely there's this, it's probably going to be in the quadrillions of parameters, if you want to put it in that language of how humans, sort of bat around making decisions about language use. So I just think it's a really kind of impoverished metaphor to say it has learned this universal language of everything. I think that totally is utterly mystifying for most members of the public and really does more harm than good.
Yeah, and I think it also promotes an idea that I know that you and I dispute, which is the very concept of a universal language. That's a very Chomskyan idea of language. And of course, Chomsky really advanced linguistics in a lot of ways, but I tend to be more of an anti-Chomskyan. I tend to believe that language is not really universal. There's no sort of universal language that babies have a structure of that they then sort of discover throughout their lives. I think it's more that people in their day-to-day, year-to-year, situation-to-situation experiences, you accrue language, and your language can change. I mean, my language changes a ton based on who I'm talking to. And of course, we have ideas of like code switching in minority communities, but also even just sort of echoing and mirroring. Whenever I'm like hanging out with one person a lot for an extended period, I start to talk like that person. And I start to talk in the way that we talk together, right?
Yes.
And so that's just a very prosaic example of how language is not universal. Language is constantly shifting and changing based on situation and relationship and context. And that's something else that these models just can't really imitate.
Absolutely. Yeah, fundamentally cannot do so. So we get this kind of pithy statement from Tristan Harris at the very end of this segment. I'm not going to play the clip here just because I think it kind of speaks for itself to gloss it, where he says, like all of these companies, OpenAI, Microsoft, and Google, need to be held accountable for the harms that they would create so that they're incentivized to pull back, to go slower with AI development, which again, it's never really clear what that is supposed to mean. This is mirroring the language of the kind of like the slow down AI development letter that came from a lot of these kinds of nonprofits and think tanks, and that fundamentally we need laws. That's the only thing he, when Oprah says, who's holding them accountable? He just says, we need laws, which doesn't really put the onus or the agency on anyone in particular. Just says like, well, some laws should probably be made.
Yeah. I mean, it crystallizes the extent to which this feels like they might have even gotten feedback on the script for the episode. And they were like, you need a section with some guys like this. Make sure that you at least give some guys like this, like a 5-minute platform.
Right.
So that they can say something like, we need laws. Give us the laws. But don't actually get into the nitty gritty of what those laws might look like, how they might affect the bottom line of these companies, to what extent you would and should shut out the companies from the legislation process because they're going to try to have their hands in it.
Sam Altman's already talking to people from the government every few days, right? How can we say that he's not helping write those laws?
Exactly. And also don't talk about like earlier laws that we probably should have established around intellectual property, privacy, data, you know, the handling of data, the commodification of personal data. Those things really, I think, should have happened a long time ago and would have prevented a lot of the maligned uses of these technologies. And so the extent to which that can be recovered and made part of these laws, also don't talk about that, because that would open up a hornet's nest.
That's exactly right. So speaking of laws and the holding of malicious bad actors to account, the next section that we have in this special is called Bad Guys. And this is, of course, referring to Bill Gates. Oh, wait, no. Sorry, that comes later. No, instead for bad guys. Sorry, little
Sam Altman. No.
Some Freudian slips going on over here. No, instead, during the bad guys segment, we have Christopher Wray, the director of the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation, who comes on to talk a little bit about what he sees as the biggest threats in the age of AI. So let's hear, at least domestically, what is he thinking about in terms of threats caused by AI?
Right now, AI is most useful in taking what I would call JV criminals and making them varsity.
How so?
And that's a problem.
How so?
For sure. We had a case not that long ago with a child psychiatrist in North Carolina who took images that he was able to get online and then manipulate them using AI to make them into child pornography. One of the things that made this particular example so egregious and horrifying is that the child psychiatrist took photos from decades earlier, from the first day of school, a school dance, that kind of thing, and essentially was able to manipulate those images to show them naked.
Wow.
So again, we get, the millions of children that Marques Brownlee referred to earlier, training AI image data sets. I think Wray is kind of simplifying this here to say, well, it's because he was the one who took their pictures and fed them into this model and everything. But like, the model needed more than just those pictures in order to create something like the horrifying images that he's describing here. And there's really no mention of the complicity of the companies themselves in facilitating these kinds of crimes, or the people who are collecting these data sets that are not cleaning them, or anonymous, like, children's faces, like taking, or bodies, taking them out of that. Like there's so much context that is stripped from this to say, well, it's just taking the people who are already doing bad stuff and it's just making them into varsity criminals.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the FBI is a major customer of the NSA, which gets a ton of this kind of data. And it does have practices in place to minimize like American citizen data. I'm not aware of practices for minimizing foreign citizen data, like foreign kids. And I'm sure there are a ton of pictures of them out there that are making their way into the NSA's data sets. And as we saw with Edward Snowden and a ton of other leakers, you can have actors within these institutions who are JV trying to get to varsity and who can exploit their access in all kinds of ways. We're lucky that Edward Snowden largely had the public's good in mind with how he used his access. But there have been a ton of, malign actors within the government who have used their access to do really bad things. And so that's something that just gets glossed over here. We're told about like an evil civilian doing something, but as you're saying, we're not talking about evil at scale or evil with extraordinary access within institutions of power.
That's exactly right. And I'm really glad that you brought up that kind of, the example of malicious actors from inside the US state, doing things that are not in the US citizenry's public interest. Because the other example that Wray gives us of malicious uses of this technology is, of course, to, beat the drums of, foreign policy saber rattling, to use a horrible mixed metaphor there. Let's go ahead and listen to what he regards as the larger threat to AI AI in terms of national security abroad?
To me, no country represents a broader, more severe, more comprehensive threat to American innovation, American ideas, to our economic security, and ultimately our national security than the Chinese government. China has a bigger hacking program already than that of every major nation combined, and has stolen more of Americans' personal and corporate data than every nation, big or small, combined. The scale of the threat is significant. If you took the FBI's program and just said, forget Russia, forget Iran, just do nothing but China, the Chinese government's hacking program, they would outnumber us 50-1.
Ooh, chilling, Calvin. Are you scared yet? Are you scared of the bear that is lurking in the woods, if there is a bear?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is just, and it's important to note for people who aren't watching the special along with us as we talk, that while Christopher Wray is intoning terrifyingly about China, there are all of these pretty like old school propaganda film type shots of the Forbidden City and President Xi Jinping and like other like Chinese iconography. There's like footage of China and how evil and scary and dictatorial China is. This is really like old school warmongering propaganda here. And it's probably like the most disturbing part of the special. And particularly, it's important to mention here that China actually has much more restrictive laws about LLMs and other quote unquote AI technologies than the US does. I'm pretty sure all of the major LLMs have been banned in China. And that doesn't mean that Chinese technologists aren't still building LLMs, but it's a much less laissez-faire environment for that kind of technical development than it is here. And what we've seen is that often that laissez-faire environment leads to the creation of technologies that do harm. And so there are definitely two distinct approaches to LLMs happening between China and the United States, but it's not clear which has the worse ethical impact. And of course, something else that we learned from the Snowden leaks is the extent to which the US has a massive offensive cyber war program.
Yes.
So we have no reason to believe that malicious and offensive uses of quote unquote AI technologies are not coming out of the US state, the US intelligence community, the CIA. In fact, we should assume that that is happening because, you know, we've been doing it for generations. The US helped Israel hack Iran's nuclear program about 10, 12 years ago. And that kind of offensive hacking happens all the time. So we should expect that the US state is using AI technologies to do that as well.
Yeah, you have this double standard, I should say, of the sort of like, it's valid when we do it, it's not valid when they do it. You know, Stuxnet and everything like that was totally justified. And, you know, anything that the Chinese government has done, which I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Calvin, but it does not feel to me like, I mean, I know he says that China has stolen more of America's personal and corporate data than every nation, big or small, combined, but like, in terms of the scale of threat, like in terms of things that have actually been verified, it is primarily Russia and Iran that have actually attempted to use like high profile hacks and leaks, like meddling in elections and things like that, or like, you know, Iran just recently leaking data from the Trump campaign to the Biden camp or things like that, which like, it just seems to be like, you know, China, like because of all the things that we've talked about previously with the need for control over information communication technology infrastructure, the chip processing, and just like overall, like it's just another arms race is kind of what it feels like to me. And you can place anything in that rubric of how we militate an arms race, and it's always going to come up like, yep, China's the biggest threat because economically they are the biggest, you know, competitor of the US on a global stage.
Yeah, 100%. You're right. And there hasn't been a lot of public sphere evidence of Chinese, I mean, meddling in elections, number one, let alone what he implies, which is like massive hacks and surveillance of US citizens. There's not been a ton of evidence of that. On the other hand, we do know that there's a ton of public sphere evidence of our own government surveilling US citizens and hacking their data. And so, and that's just US citizens. That's leaving aside the rest of the world where laws are extremely permissive for the intelligence community to collect data and do pretty much whatever it wants with it, including US data that travels to foreign data centers, which happens all the time given the distributed nature of the internet. But yeah, this is just kind of, as you're saying, there's an existing rubric that we have for talking about China, and Wray is shoehorning the AI conversation into that rubric to say, okay, we know that we have to establish China as the boogeyman. Let's apply AI to that.
That's pretty much precisely what it felt like to me. So beyond the kinds of bad guys that Christopher Wray is presenting to us, we have another bad guy who brings his way onto the scene here in this next chapter: health, education, and jobs.
Yeah, let's. I love that those three are, again, it's a little bit like the kind of token AI critics, give them 5 minutes. Three pretty minor topics.
Oh yeah, yep. just three small things that we're going to give it over to one man to talk about. And who better to lead the way than America's greatest, most long-reigning oligarch, Seattle, Washington, neighbor of Calvin Pollock, Bill Gates. So Bill Gates gives a couple of things. Obviously, Oprah is throwing him all the questions about, like, in what ways is this going to disrupt our industries? Bill Gates is mostly giving answers that are saying, like, well, it's actually just going to make things easier for everyone, right? Specifically when he's talking about medical care, where he talks about the use of AI. This is one of the only instances that we get of anybody mentioning something about AI that is being used to develop drugs or to be able to, ideate these, vaccines or novel cures for novel diseases and things like that. But then he gets to the actual patient and doctor side of things. And this is what he has to say about the use of AI.
But perhaps even more profoundly, whenever you're confused about medical things. I mean, even in the US, your bill is confusing, your MRI report is confusing.
Yeah.
That can be dramatically improved.
So kind of distilling down the biggest issues that you as a consumer have with the healthcare infrastructure in this country is that things are just really confusing. And, wouldn't it be great if you had a language model that was able to bring things down to your level to make sure that you understand your bill? Because again, certainly there's nothing about the way that private healthcare companies purposefully obfuscate parts of your bill or other pieces of information so that it makes it more confusing and difficult to navigate, or to, say, question charges that you're being given for certain kinds of care or other things like that. There's a lot that's being glossed over here. I don't know. What did you make of this section, Calvin?
I mean, this is kind of the biggest problem with so much of this AI discourse, is that it becomes a ready-made explanation, solution, answer to these enduring problems that require collective action and policy change. So, like, let's make the healthcare system less confusing for users and for patients by giving you an LLM to talk to along with your doctor when your doctor says something confusing, or when your doctor says, here's how much you're going to have to pay. The LLM is going to break down what goes into that, or it's going to, like, analyze your chart for you, rather than saying, let's create a much simpler system with a single payer, and where we have price controls on how much, just like they recently did with insulin, like one of the best accomplishments of the Biden administration. We're going to set a limit on how much a checkup will cost you, as opposed to this incredibly confusing experience that I think a lot of us have had, where like you pick a doctor and then you realize at the end of the appointment that just a simple checkup with that doctor is going to cost you like $300. And you're like, why though? That's can an LLM help you with that? No, probably not, because it has to do with coverage and deductibles and all of these confusing aspects of the healthcare system that are policy questions. They're not questions of communication or like the technical nature of health as this scientific field. It's really something that we've built up through policy to make insurance companies richer.
Yes. Yeah. It's not that complicated, actually, when you really get down to it. It's just that we have an infrastructure in this country that benefits primarily private companies at the expense of people who need care. And that's innovation, baby. That's entrepreneurship. Speaking of entrepreneurship, Oprah now questions Bill Gates about probably one of the things that is closest to our hearts, which is education. So here is what Bill and Oprah are both excited about when it comes to the prospect of AI and personalized learning.
One of the things that's exciting to me is how this is going to impact kids and their personal learning.
Yeah, the dream that you could have a tutor who's always available to you and understands how to motivate you, what your level of knowledge is. This software should give us that. When you're outside the classroom, that personal tutor is helping you out, encouraging you. And then your teacher, talks to the personal tutor and says, okay, what's your advice about how I do things in class the next day? They won't have to spend time grading homework. They'll immediately know how that went.
Does this mean you eventually don't have teachers and everybody just has their own AI teacher?
We're trying to help teachers, that personal engagement, motivating a kid, meeting them where they are. The AI in no way is a replacement for that. But the fact that as the teacher's saying, okay, what should you work on? It's working at your level, that personalized notion. And, we can see it's already working pretty well.
I love just the way that he stammers and hems and haws when she asks that question about like, does this mean that the vision you're presenting is going to mean that we don't have teachers anymore? And he's like, well, we're trying to help them. For now, we're trying to help them, just support them. But he lands on that line that he just says, we can already see it's working pretty well. I have no idea what he's referring to there. And I like to think I keep pretty current on this kind of thing, but like, I don't know. Did you have any other ideas about what he could possibly like the idea that it's already, to get into this, I guess, this notion of personalized learning is the thing that every educational technologist and tech entrepreneur, more than anything, from time immemorial has held up as the sort of gold standard, is that learning should always be this personalized thing that is always tailored to your own individual unique needs as a learner, and not the idea, for example, that like learning is a social process, something that we need to do that has to be embedded in social interaction, that perhaps, because again, this has largely been untested, I think. Again, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but having a child who is taught fully by autonomous systems or computer software, to me, it seems like it would be doing a real disservice to a child to try and educate them from a young age without any form of interaction from not even just peers, but, adults that they can trust and learn to emulate or, learn from. I don't know. What did you make of this quote,
Yeah,
Kevin?
Look, I can't claim to be an expert on like primary education. I think a lot of what he's talking about deals with that and kind of like developmental education. My experience is entirely in college classrooms, but I think that if there's any nugget of truth to this, it might be simply having LLMs or chatbots as kind of a place to explore and ask questions and like experiment with ideas. And I think especially for students who have social anxiety or have especially anxiety around language specifically, this can be a useful tool for that reason. I've heard from a number of international students that their writing has progressed a lot, just being able to experiment with LLMs and like put in a sentence that they wrote and ask the LLM how it would write it in a more standard American English way, which of course is embedded with all kinds of ideological assumptions that we probably don't have time to unpack right now. But I think that the tool has applications in that way. But I always get nervous when we're talking about replacing parts of the teacher's job with technology. Of course, you want to be able to do the drudgery more easily and like get to the real sort of idea development and like higher level intellectual work of teaching. That's all to the good. But yeah, this idea of personalized education, that's going to happen as a result of LLMs, I think we need to be skeptical of it and critical of it, and particularly if that involves a lot of, again, data capture from students in order to tailor their education to them. That would disturb me. And Microsoft has a long history of that. We should not look at these figures as just sort of neutral observers of technical development. Like Bill Gates stewarded Microsoft through some of its most controversial periods when there were antitrust suits against Microsoft, when Microsoft was a major government contractor for surveillance programs and other kinds of military technologies. And so we should be skeptical of this guy. His take on something like education is incredibly suffused with all of that baggage.
Yeah, Bill Gates to me has always been this kind of sterling example of somebody who is able to like launder the fact that he is a billionaire and has, you know, this incredible amount of power in society by saying, well, look, I'm using so much of my money for philanthropy and for investing in things like education. And, you know, maybe that means that, you know, entire, let's say, university or college campuses become users of solely Microsoft products. And, you know, well, you don't have to think about that. The fact that we're creating this entire generation of students who are now reliant on Microsoft products and don't know how to use anything else. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's plenty of reasons to be skeptical of this, because all philanthropic investments at the scale of what somebody like Bill Gates is doing is always kind of a form of soft power. And I think that particularly
and tax avoidance.
And tax avoidance. Yep. Oh, absolutely. That is not to be overlooked. And so to presume that, you know, somebody is coming on to the, you know, especially somebody who is, you know, Microsoft is a huge investor in OpenAI. Like they are more or less working hand in hand at this point. And to say that this person is a sort of neutral observer of the way that this technology might be used is, you know, farcical. I mean, he is completely, he has an utter vested interest, possibly more of a vested interest in the normalization and uptake of this technology into institutions that we consider to be kind of core to our society, like the workforce, like healthcare, like education, that, you know, I don't know. I mean, I don't see any reason to be anything other than skeptical of what the future that Bill Gates is proffering for us.
100%.
So I think we want to bring it around to a conclusion here by talking about the final section, which I actually did not know was coming. They didn't advertise that this person was going to be part of this. So this last chapter, chapter 5, is called Irreplaceable Humans. And it features a brief interview segment between Oprah and an essayist and novelist named Marilynne Robinson, the author of the Gilead novels, among many other works of both fiction and nonfiction. And so as a writer, she's kind of asking her, what is your perspective on artificial intelligence? I'm going to quote from them at length here because I think it's really worth listening to in total.
So what do you make of this moment that we're in and these two words, artificial intelligence?
Well, you know, it's certainly a departure from any sense of intelligence we have had up to this point. You know, the mulling, cumulative knowing and interpreting the world that has been called intelligence.
Because we've always thought of them as uniquely human traits.
Exactly. The impulse behind it seems to be to eliminate the human hand and the human eye in the making of the reality that we inhabit to the farthest extent possible. With the effect of concentrating power in the sense of the control of this strange fantasy within very few people's hands and consolidating masses of capital and masses of natural resources devoted to this very dubious project. It's just a human impulse to escape from its humanity, which is something that happens over and over again historically. The impulse to say that there's nothing intrinsic about a human person that cannot, in theory, be replicated by something that, frankly, works cheaper, works faster. I don't know why it is, but it's part of our human lot to be uncomfortable with our humanity and to mechanize it, out of existence in some way. We're not enough in love with our own existence, and we're not enough in love with everyone else's existence, and I think that's very dangerous.
But hasn't that been the nature of who we are as human beings? Always seeking the next, the more, the better, the other?
We generalize from the behavior of people who tend to dominate historical narrative and are very frightening people in many, many cases. Not the kind of people we would have wished to be making great decisions.
So some real kind of sobering commentary from Marilyn Robinson there. I really did appreciate when she landed on that line about concentrating power in the sense of control of this strange fantasy within very few people's hands, consolidating masses of capital and masses of natural resources devoted to this very dubious project. Like,
yeah, that was hard hitting. And then
I'm surprised they let that make it to air.
I know. And then also this idea of we generalize from the behavior of people who tend to dominate historical narrative and are very frightening people in many, many cases. I mean, that's really, in so many words, talking about colonization and war and the notion that might is right, that like because you got there first and you dominated with your model, your technology, your society, that like therefore it's normal, it's natural, it's correct, right? And that's a really powerful critique. I think this final segment was the thing that surprised me the most about the special, because Oprah allows, prior to this, a lot of extreme propaganda to go unchecked and uncritiqued. And ironically, like this somewhat subtle reference to colonization is exactly what Christopher Wray and the intelligence community and the military seem to want to do to China and to like the parts of the world that China has good relations with. And so it's very striking, like presented alongside all of that stuff from Wray and the stuff from Sam Altman.
Yeah. Very frightening people in many, many cases, such as the ones that you saw in the last half hour of this special. It is, as you say, it's startling that she is able to cut through the kinds of messages that we're being given and cut to something that I think is more important here, that is just the underlying ideological assumptions of all of this, like any sort of progress narrative that underlies, be it AI or colonization or colonialism. Like, I think that there are assumptions running underneath both that Oprah is giving a name to here. Then isn't it the nature of human beings to always seek more, to seek better, and to seek, the other? And she says, well, not everyone, right? And that's
a particular cultural tradition. Those are values, and they're situated in particular cultures.
Yes. Yeah, it's really, really powerful the way that she just sort of like immediately dispatches with that and says, no, not all of us want that. And yeah, I mean, in terms of her, kind of talking about the impulse of humanity to escape from itself or to escape from its humanness. I mean, I do see what she's saying to a degree there in terms of the sort of part of the human condition as being uncomfortable with the sort of inevitability of suffering or of making mistakes that cause pain or friction or other things like that. And I think there's one last clip that I wanted to play from her that really kind of cuts to the heart of, particularly when we think about AI and language and writing and other things like that really hits hard. So this is the last section that I want to play from the special.
What is the thing that concerns you the most about AI?
I'm afraid that there will be so much investment of every kind into this project that it will have its consequences before it really deserves them. And so there will be all kinds of cutting back on all kinds of employment and so on, anticipating this insurgence of AI. And then it will turn out that it's a bad project, that it's more dangerous than it is valuable and so on. And so we will have a disrupted economy on one hand and an unusable technology on the other.
But it's also going to, no question about it, it's going to make life a lot easier for a lot of people. So what's wrong with that?
American schools ask for a lot of written work from students, and that's a very good thing. That's an autonomy creating exercise, Mm-hmm. But what we don't do, we don't tell them that this is a discipline, like an athletic discipline, that they have undertaken to strengthen themselves, not just to bring themselves over some arbitrary line of sufficiency.
That it's the discipline of doing the work and the thinking process.
Exactly. And students say writing is difficult, which of course it is.
It is.
But difficulty is the point.
So isn't it going to make things easier for people? Robinson's response, but difficulty is the point. What did you make of that, Calvin?
Yeah, I would say this is my one disagreement with Robinson. And this comes back to our previous episode with Scott Graham. And it relates to my own experience as a teacher and as an occasional begrudging user of LLMs. They don't actually make it easier. Like I have encountered very few entire writing situations that have been made easier by LLMs. And I think that those of us as writing instructors and communication instructors, we have a responsibility to design assignments where like that assignment as a rhetorical situation cannot be easily plugged and played with LLMs. There should be components to your assignment that just can't be hacked by that kind of simple, because I do really think, I bet like one day when we learn more about the development of this technology, that so much of it was just tech bros trying to come up with a solution to get out of their English classes, like to find a way to not have to do writing homework or do it really quickly so they can focus on their CS classes. And that, I mean, that's a call to action for us to make our classes better and more engaging and to clarify the value of what we teach, And I do think Marilyn Robinson is getting at that as well. But I have found that it's actually really difficult to get good output from these things. And that there may be some situations where there's like a drudgery aspect of writing that it can help with, like taking a certain stretch of text and making it more concise for a very discrete use, or extrapolating from what you've written and coming up with some title ideas or section headings or something like that, right? And so I think applications like that are somewhat rote or maybe something that you want to experiment with automation around, I think can be useful to explore and scaffold for students. But at the end of the day, these things, as she said, I think perhaps the most striking thing she said is that we will have a disrupted economy on one hand and an unusable technology on the other. Yes. I think right now the technology is not that usable. Yep. It generates a lot of slop. And that's what you're seeing on the internet more and more. And I think it's making everyone hate the technology. I mean, I have a ton of students who refuse to use it because they hate it. They see the AI brand as like poisonous and corny and tacky.
Yes.
And that's great. I think that's a grounds that we should critique it on, is say like, look how bad this is and how you can do better. Right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Whenever I do use AI as a pedagogical tool, for the most part, it is as a way of critiquing these assumptions that we have about writing, that it should be like, if you're really good at writing, it should be something that comes just as easy as typing in a prompt to ChatGPT and having it, magically type out all of these words, right? Like that's something you should be able to do if you're a good writer. And if you're not, well, you need ChatGPT to make your life easier, right? I mean, my quibble here, because I totally agree with you, but I honestly think it was kind of Oprah who was bringing that line to the forefront.
Right.
When she says, it's no question about it, it's going to make life a lot easier for people. And why would you be against that? And I mean, I think directly to your point, no, it's not. I don't think it has at this point. I don't think there's any real appreciable evidence at a large scale. Again, just the fact that, going back to the beginning, people are still asking, like, why do we need this in our lives? That's all the evidence you need right there, right? If it really was going to make everybody's lives easier and totally transform things, make us all grow bigger, faster, stronger in all these sorts of ways, it would have done it already, or we would at least be able to like have this common awareness that it's doing that, but we don't. And that's why I think these companies need things like the Oprah AI special. That's why, ABC, owned by Disney, who is also certainly investing heavily in AI right now, needs to bankroll specials like this in order to prop up this technology, because it is a product that's in a market suffused with financial speculation that is all bolstered by hype. And fundamentally, that is kind of what this is. It's a hype document that's designed to inflate the perceived value of a technology that has not proven its own worth on its own terms or with its own merit yet, which directly to Marilyn Robinson's point, I'm so glad that she said, as you mentioned, the disrupted economy, that this, we're going to make so much investment into this. We're going to draw so many resources away from other things that we could be that our government or our institutions could be spending money on before it has even proven that it deserves any of those resources. Because fundamentally, despite what every blue check, doofus on X is going to say, how many graphs they're going to give us that say, "Ooh, line going up, ChatGPT get better," it isn't. Because if it was, people would be using it.
Well, and fundamentally, it can't do the things that it pretends to do.
Yes.
There's always going to be that gap.
Yes. That's far more to the point. The fact that, when she says that writing specifically, and the fact that we ask for a lot of written work from students is a good thing, I also agree with that, because again, not only because, as she says, it's an autonomy creating exercise, but it's also the kind of thing that makes visible for you the way that you think and the way that you go from ideas to voice, to the public voicing of your ideas and participating in this broader, process of knowledge construction and negotiation. It's something that to your point about your students, my students also express similar types of skepticism, because it's just not as much fun when you bring something else into a colleague of mine uses the metaphor that, using AI to write 1,500 words is like bringing a forklift into the weight room, right? It can do that task pretty easily. It can lift all that weight. It can produce the number of words exactly with very minimal effort, but it's really not that impressive. And it really isn't training you to do anything worthwhile necessarily, right? Like we could talk about the kinds of things that prompt engineering or probing AI could help us do, but I don't think it's really going to replace anything. If nothing else, it just adds something new to a repertoire of rhetorical knowledges that students can use, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you could also say it's like, it's like drone bombing the weight room.
Wait, what?
I'm just trying to think, because for me, my only quibble with that metaphor is that I don't think it's the same thing. I don't think it's the same communicative act.
Sure.
It's not a shortcut to the same communicative act. It's a different communicative act.
Right.
Because what you get out is a totally different piece of rhetoric and communication than something you quote unquote generate quote unquote yourself.
That's
Heavy air
true.
quotes around both of those, because obviously listen to our episode on dialogicality to learn more about why all language is polysemous and you never create anything entirely from scratch. But there's so much here, Alex. I think that, like, at the end of the day, this special is a fascinating document. It's also really funny because I wonder if we're one of, like, 70 people who watched it. Like, I've heard no one else talk about this. But I'm sure that many AI skeptic podcasts will be doing similar work.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's my best hope, is that, we were the only ones who took the time to watch this. And
again, as we often say on our Rejoinder episodes, we watched it so you didn't have to.
You don't have to. That's exactly right. Oh, man. Well, I think we've cooked this goose pretty thoroughly, Calvin, wouldn't you say?
I would say so. And we used all the best AI tools to do it. I had my LLM come up with the goose cooking recipe for me, the steps, the kind of equipment that I might need, and generate a picture of the goose trained on many previous geese who did not give their consent.
Yes, many geese children gave their likeness to create this for you,
for the making of this
this
roast goose meal.
Do you ever think that this podcast will someday be used as training data for somebody's
I'm sure
AI
it already
program?
is, man.
Oh,
we gotta keep an eye out.
Jeez. Yeah. Okay. So if anybody out there, sounds mysteriously like us, but doesn't, is saying AI is very good. We love AI. It is wonderful. Just know that
happily give up our jobs too. AI. Yeah.
AI can podcast better than Alex and Calvin.
It's not real. I promise it's not real.
No, it absolutely is not. Well, thank you all for coming on this wild ride with us. I hope that you're leaving it a little bit more educated and less mystified about the kinds of AI hype tropes that you'll see in media like this, and gave you a little bit of food for thought in your own
And please,
life.
for the love of God, call them LLMs. Don't call them AI.
It's not AI. Yes.
That is Calvin Pollock's last request of the audience.
Words to live by. We appreciate it. Well, until next time, everyone, take care. We'll talk to you and come at you again soon. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Our show today was produced by Alex Helberg and Calvin Pollock, with editing work by Calvin and editorial assistance from Alex. Reverb's co-producers at large are Ben Williams, Sophie Wadzak, and Olivia Burnett. You can subscribe to Reverb and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Android, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out our website at www.reverbcast.com. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ReverbCast. That's REVERB_CAST. If you've enjoyed our show and want to help amplify more of our public scholarship work, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. And tell a friend about us. We sincerely appreciate the support of our listeners. Thanks so much for tuning in.